Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's story, a young scout warns a proud galactic empire that humans aren't just another weak species. But her report gets laughed off, and that arrogance leads straight to disaster when a small Terran colony triggers a rapid, overwhelming defense response that the invaders can't even comprehend. The biggest lesson is this: never confuse confidence with correctness. Listen to evidence, respect warnings, especially from the people doing the real work. And remember that true strength isn't showing off power, it's having the discipline to use it responsibly and choose diplomacy before pride turns a mistake into a war. If you enjoyed this story and its message, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more English stories and life lessons. Imagine a room so massive it has its own weather, a place designed to make empires feel small. That was the Grand War Chamber of the Veloxy hegemony. It wasn't on a planet. It floated in the empty dark, orbiting a gas giant named Theos 9. It was a giant crystal space station, catching the light of 3 distant suns and shattering it into rainbows across walls taller than skyscrapers. You couldn't even see the ceiling. The floor was a perfect black mirror. Every single detail was engineered to scream one thing: you are in the heart of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy, and you are nothing. And on this day, it was packed with representatives from over 60 conquered species, all crammed into the observation decks. The central ring of seats was filled with decorated commanders from a dozen different battle fleets, their iridescent scales shimmering as they shifted and whispered to each other. Above them, strategists, weapons designers, and political officers filled every available space. The very air buzzed with 100 different languages, all humming through translation devices. And at the absolute center of it all, on a raised throne of black crystal, sat Supreme Arbiter HFY. Even for a Veloxy, he was intimidating. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, with 4 powerful arms crossed over a chest covered in scales that flickered from deep blue to brilliant silver in the light. He had these huge golden eyes that held the gaze of a man who had never, not once in his entire life, been told no. This was the guy who had conquered 11 species personally. He'd expanded the hegemony across 2 entire arms of the galaxy. To him, war wasn't a gamble. It was a math problem, and he had never, ever gotten the answer wrong. Today was supposed to be just another boring meeting, reviewing borders, allocating resources, deploying fleets. Predictable. But then, a young scout commander named Yil asked to speak. The first thing everyone noticed was just how young she was. She was young, and for a Veloxy, she was small, barely 2 meters tall, with scales that were still a pale, immature color. She stood at the speaker's platform, way down below HFY's throne, and as she looked up at the terrifying power of the hegemony assembled before her, you could see her hands shaking. She had just gotten back from a 6-month solo recon mission deep in the Orion Arm, charting out a region the hegemony had never bothered to look at closely. Most of what she'd found was, well, boring. Stone Age civilizations, a few minor species who had just figured out space travel but had no military. The usual stuff the hegemony would eventually swallow up whenever they got around to it. But she found one species that was different. She called them Terrans. "They are bipedal, warm-blooded mammals," Yil began, and the room's speakers made her voice sound thin and tiny in the cavernous space. "Carbon-based, oxygen breathers. Their average height is about 1.7 meters, and they come from a single temperate world, the 3rd planet from their star." She paused, her eyes fixed on her datapad. You could tell the next number she was about to say made her sick to her stomach. "Their home world has a population of approximately 8 billion individuals." For 2 solid seconds, the chamber was dead silent. And then someone laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of disbelief from a fleet commander. Then another laugh echoed from across the room. Then more, In moments, a wave of laughter rolled through the war chamber, bouncing off the crystal walls and getting louder with every echo. 8 billion. On one planet? The entire Veloxy hegemony, spread across hundreds of star systems and dozens of species, had a total population of 12 billion. And this little scout was claiming that a single planet of soft-skinned apes was home to 8 billion of them. HFY didn't laugh, though. He just smiled, and that was so much worse. "Scout Commander," he said, his voice slicing through the laughter and silencing it instantly. "Are you absolutely certain of this number?" "Yes, Supreme Arbiter," she replied. "I ran multiple independent counts using different methods. If anything, that number might be low. Their own census data, which they broadcast openly, suggests the real number could be even higher." "They broadcast their census data?" one of the commanders in the central ring asked, incredulous. "They broadcast everything," Yill said. "Their communications are almost entirely unencrypted. News, entertainment, private messages, even military communications. It's like they have no concept of information security as a civilization. I was able to listen to their entire planet's electromagnetic output from the edge of their system without even trying to be stealthy." More laughter erupted. A species that couldn't even keep its own secrets? This was what she was so worried about? Yill pressed on, feeling the room slipping away from her. "Despite this, their military capability should not be underestimated. The Terrans have only been a spacefaring species for a very short time, but their rate of technological progress is alarming. They went from their first powered flight to nuclear weapons in about 40 of their years," she explained. "From nukes to functional space travel in less than 30, and from their first colony ships to a whole network of established worlds in under 2 centuries. She pulled up a chart, and on it, the curve of Terran progress was an almost perfectly vertical line compared to the gentle slopes of every other known species. "More importantly," she continued, "the Terrans don't specialize their population like we do. In the hegemony, only a dedicated warrior class serves in the military, usually between 2 and 5% of the population. But among Terrans, military service is open to their entire adult population. Many of their civilians have combat training. Their culture celebrates physical fitness, competition, aggression, and something they call resilience." She took a shaky breath. "They have been fighting wars among themselves for their entire recorded history. Thousands of years of constant, brutal conflict, often involving millions of soldiers at a time. They developed weapons powerful enough to destroy their own planet, and then chose not to use them. Not because they were scared, but because they developed complex strategies to manage the threat. They practice war the way other species practice farming. It is the one thing they are absolute masters of." The laughter had finally stopped, but it wasn't because they were taking her seriously. It had stopped because they were getting bored. Yill could see it in the way the commanders were shifting in their seats, the way their aides were glancing at their own data pads. She saw it in HFY's smile, which had become fixed and patient, like an adult waiting for a child to finish telling a long, pointless story. She decided to try one last time. "Supreme Arbiter, I am formally recommending that the Terran species be classified as an existential threat. I recommend that all hegemony fleets maintain a minimum buffer of 50 light-years from any known Terran territory, and I recommend that no contact, friendly or hostile, be initiated until a dedicated team can complete a full strategic analysis." She lowered her data pad. "I believe a military confrontation with this species would be catastrophic for the hegemony." The silence that followed was the absolute worst kind. It wasn't the silence of people thinking. It was the silence of pity. The kind of quiet that fills a room when everyone is embarrassed for the person who just spoke. HFY leaned forward. "Scout Commander Yill," he said, his tone as gentle as a razor's edge. I appreciate your thoroughness. I really do. Deep-range recon is lonely, difficult work. But, he paused, I think you've made a mistake common among young officers. You have confused quantity with quality. He stood up, unfolding all 4 of his arms and gesturing to the entire chamber. The hegemony has faced large populations before, he boomed. The Grek had 6 billion on their home world when we found them. They had nukes. They had a warrior culture. They lasted 6 rotations. The Venen had 4 billion living on orbital defense platforms. They lasted 8. Numbers, Scout Commander, are meaningless without the technology, strategy, and will to use them. He looked down at her from his throne. 8 billion soft-bodied primates on one little planet, shouting their secrets into the void and fighting each other like animals in a cage. This isn't a threat. This is a species that hasn't learned to be quiet in a very dangerous universe. The laughter returned, louder and more confident this time. Commanders slapped the arms of their chairs in amusement. Someone in the gallery made a crude joke about Death World monkeys that got a huge roar of approval. Yil just stood there on the platform, a cold dread settling deep in her chest. It wasn't embarrassment. It was the feeling you get when you're standing on a cliff, watching someone you care about walk straight for the edge with their eyes closed. Supreme Arbiter, she said, her voice barely a whisper. With all due respect, the Grek did not have faster-than-light travel. The Venen did not have true artificial intelligence. The Terrans have both. And they've had them long enough to build things I couldn't even fully analyze in my 6 months of watching them. I saw shipyards in their system that were building vessels at a rate that exceeds our most productive facilities by a factor of, That will be sufficient, Scout Commander. Model Mumishi. Cakesvone's voice was as cold and sharp as fractured ice. You've made your report. It's been noted. You're dismissed. That final word, dismissed, slammed down like a prison gate. Yell froze. She scanned the council chamber, desperately searching for one face, just one, that showed a flicker of doubt or concern. Anything besides the casual amusement and total indifference staring back at her. And then she found it. Tucked away in a corner of the central ring, half hidden by a pillar of black crystal, sat Drenoch. He was a Torvon, one of the rare non-Voxy allowed at the war table, tolerated only because his species could spot patterns in ways even the prideful Voxy had to respect. By any standard, he was ancient. His gray-green skin was a roadmap of scars from campaigns that were history long before most of the officers in this room were even born. His 3 eyes watched Yell, his expression unreadable. But he wasn't laughing. Yell scooped up her datapad and stepped down from the speaker's platform. A low buzz of chatter rose behind her as the summit immediately moved on to tedious reports about resource allocation and border patrol schedules. Her warning was already forgotten, destined to become a running joke told in officers' clubs for years to come. The story of the rookie scout who ran back from the Orion Arm, terrified of a bunch of monkeys. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard the footsteps. Heavy, uneven. Torvon footsteps. She stopped, but didn't dare turn around. Scout Commander! Drenoch's voice sounded like rocks grinding together in a steel drum. He came to a halt beside her. He was shorter than her, but twice as broad, built like a boulder meant to weather any storm. You did well in there, he rumbled. I was laughed at and officially reprimanded. Yeah, he said. The two are not mutually exclusive. Doing your job well often means delivering an accurate report to people who refuse to hear it. Yell finally met his gaze. His 3 eyes bore into her with an unnerving intensity. You believe me? She whispered. I believe your data. Data doesn't care if it gets laughed at. He paused for a moment. I do have one question, though. Your report was meticulous, but you left one detail out. What was that? Their ships. You gave us production rates and fleet numbers, but you never described the ships themselves. What do they look like? Yell fell silent for a long moment. She'd left that part out because she didn't know how to put what she'd seen into words the war chamber would understand. The hegemony built magnificent warships, all elegant curves, flowing lines, and gleaming hulls that mirrored the stars. Hegemony ships were built to inspire awe, to scream superiority at first glance. The Terran ships, they were nothing like that. "Wrong," she said at last. Their ships just looked wrong, like they were designed by a species that had already made peace with dying and was just looking for an enemy to take with them. Drenok didn't respond for a long time, his scarred face a perfect mask. "I fought in the Ven campaign," he said finally. "I was at Grek. I have fought 7 different species for the hegemony, and I have won every single time. And never, not once, have I heard a scout describe an enemy's ships the way you just did." He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Hold on to your data, Scout Commander. Keep your reports. Keep everything. I have a feeling someone is going to want to see them again. And when they do, I promise you they will not be laughing." He turned and lumbered back toward the war chamber, his uneven footsteps echoing down the crystal hall. Yell stood alone in the corridor for a long time. 3 days later, the orders came straight from the Supreme Orbiter's office. A standard subjugation fleet of 200 warships was being sent to the Terran border system, designated Artemis IV, a small colony world with minimal strategic value. The mission was classified as a corrective incursion, a simple op to test Terran military response and claim a few resources. 200 warships for a species the Supreme Orbiter considered a minor nuisance. He'd even told his staff it was overkill, that 50 ships would be more than enough, but he figured there was no harm in being thorough. Yell read the orders on her datapad in her quarters. She read them a second time. Then she set the pad on her desk and just stared at the wall. She remembered the Terran shipyard she'd glimpsed from the edge of their system, massive orbital structures that never stopped building, churning out ship after ship with a relentless mechanical rhythm like a monstrous heartbeat. She thought about the chatter she'd intercepted, not their military signals, which were surprisingly rare and locked down tight, but their civilian ones: music, arguments, stories, laughter. An entire species that flooded the cosmos with the sheer noise of being alive, and she thought about the number that had made the entire war chamber laugh out loud. 8 billion. She also thought about what Drenok hadn't said, the part she understood perfectly. The problem wasn't the number itself. The problem was what happens when you take 8 billion members of a species that has spent its entire history learning how to fight, and you finally give them a reason to stop fighting each other and start fighting you. Far away in the Orion Arm, on a dusty, half-terraformed world called Artemis IV, 2 million humans were just living their lives. They farmed the land. They built their homes. They raised their children. They looked up at their sky and wondered what else was out there. They were about to get their answer. And so was the hegemony. Artemis IV wasn't a pretty world. Not yet, anyway. It was the kind of planet that needed another century of hard work before it would ever make it onto a postcard. The air was thin, the soil was a stubborn rust color, and the shallow oceans tasted like iron. 2 million people called it home, scattered across a few settlements linked by dirt roads and rail lines that stretched across flat, empty plains. The biggest town was called New Thessaly, with a population around 400,000, making it the closest thing to a city on a planet that felt more like a construction site. It had a spaceport, a university, a hospital, 3 bars, and a government building where the colonial governor held meetings no one ever wanted to go to. The buildings were squat, square things made from local stone because shipping materials from Earth was a fortune, and these colonists were nothing if not practical. It was early morning in New Thessaly when the sky began to change. Captain Riva Santos was the first to see it, because seeing things first was her job. She was the commanding officer of the TDF patrol corvette Whiskey Tango, a ship about the size of a big cargo freighter, currently drifting in a lazy orbit just beyond the system's asteroid belt. The Whiskey Tango was the only Terran Defense Force ship in the entire sector. This was a backwater post. Quiet. Boring. It was the kind of assignment you got when you were either brand new or you'd ticked off someone important enough to banish you to a place where nothing ever happened. Santos had been out here for 11 months. She'd definitely ticked someone off. She was sitting in her command chair, feet propped up on the console, sipping her fourth coffee of the shift and reading a novel on her tablet when her sensor officer said something that made her put the coffee down fast. "Captain, I've got contacts. Multiple contacts. FTL signatures popping up at the system's edge." Santos swung her feet to the floor. "How many?" The sensor officer, a kid fresh from the academy who'd never seen a real contact in his life, just stared at his screen. "Ma'am, I'm reading 200 FTL signatures." Santos didn't panic. She didn't yell or slam her fist on a console. She calmly placed her coffee mug in its holder, set her tablet face down on the armrest, and sat up perfectly straight. "Sound general quarters," she said, her voice steady. "Get me a visual the second they drop out of warp." The Whiskey Tango instantly came alive. White lights switched to flashing red. Crew members who'd been eating breakfast, sleeping, or playing cards were at their stations in under 90 seconds. The ship's systems hummed as they powered up from standby to full combat readiness. It wasn't frantic. It was a well-oiled machine. They had drilled this exact scenario once a week for 11 months straight. Santos had insisted on it, and her crew had grumbled about it every single time. But nobody was grumbling now. The 200 FTL signatures resolved into 200 warships. They emerged from faster-than-light travel at the system's edge in a formation clearly meant to intimidate. It was a perfect geometric diamond, layer after layer of ships arranged with a mathematical precision that could only come from centuries of military tradition. And the ships themselves, Santos had to admit, even as her heart sank, they were beautiful. They were works of art, all sweeping curves and polished hulls, reflecting the starlight like perfect mirrors. Their energy signatures pulsed with an almost musical rhythm. They looked less like war machines and more like something a sculptor would create. Imagine being outnumbered 200 to 1. That was the nightmare Captain Santos woke up to. Her tactical display was a sea of red dots, each one an enemy warship. The smallest of them was 10 times the size of her little patrol ship, the Whiskey Tango. And in the center of it all, a flagship so massive it bristled with weapon arrays and launch bays for thousands of fighters. Her screen showed one friendly green dot against 200 hostile red ones. "Well," she muttered to the quiet bridge, "that's a lot of ships." Her comms officer swiveled in his chair. "Captain, we're getting a hail from their flagship, standard frequency, totally unencrypted." "Put it on screen," she said. A voice, filtered through the ship's translator into flat, clipped English, filled the bridge. It was the kind of voice that had never known defeat, dripping with an arrogance you can't fake. "Attention, inhabitants of this star system. I am Fleet Master Orin of the Hegemony Subjugation Fleet. By the authority of the Supreme Orbiter Kayaks Vone, this entire system and everything in it now belongs to the Veoxy Hegemony. You will disarm and submit to our rule immediately. Any resistance," the voice promised, "will be met with overwhelming force. You have one standard cycle to comply. This message will not be repeated." The transmission cut out, leaving a heavy silence. Captain Santos just stared at the tactical display, watching the sea of red. Her crew watched her, waiting, not daring to breathe. Finally, she broke the silence. "Open a channel." Same frequency they used. "Channel open, Captain." Santos tugged at her uniform jacket. It was wrinkled, as always. She was a brilliant commander, but neatness was a battle she always lost. "Fleetmaster Aaron, this is Captain Riva Santos of the Terran Defense Force corvette, Whiskey Tango." As the ranking Terran officer in this system, I acknowledge your transmission. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. I'm formally requesting that you withdraw your fleet from sovereign Terran space. Artemis IV is a registered colony of the Terran Federation, and its people are under our protection. Your presence here is an act of aggression under our laws and the established rules of interstellar travel. She paused again, her voice calm and steady. Please leave. For a long moment, there was only static. Then a sound crackled over the comms. It wasn't interference. It was laughter. Captain Santos. Aaron's voice was genuinely amused, like an adult listening to a child say something absurd. I appreciate your formality. Your objection is noted. However, I have 200 warships, and you have one small patrol boat. I'm curious, how exactly do you plan to enforce that request? Santos leaned back, picked up her coffee mug, and took a long sip. It was cold, but she didn't seem to notice. I don't intend to enforce it, Fleet Master. That's not my job. My job, she said, her voice turning icy, is to make sure you understand exactly what happens next, if you don't. Consider this your why real moment. The laughter on the other end choked off instantly. The silence that came next was sharp and stunned. On the bridge of the Hegemony flagship, the throne of certainty, Fleet Master Orin stared at his console. His officers shot nervous glances at each other. How could this human know that name? The truth was simple. The Terrans had been listening to Hegemony communications for years. Not through some brilliant spy mission, but because the Hegemony, much like Earth's own ancient empires, had grown careless and arrogant with their signals. Terran intelligence had intercepted Uriel's report about them. They'd read the entire thing, including the War Chamber's dismissive response. They knew exactly what the Hegemony thought of them, and they had been paying very, very close attention ever since. I don't know what you're talking about, Orin said, but all the amusement was gone from his voice. Then let me be clearer, Santos replied. I'm sending a data packet to your flagship. It's unencrypted, no traps. You can check it yourself. It contains some information about the Terran Defense Force I think you'll find enlightening. The file popped up on Orin's display. His intel officers immediately began scanning its contents. What they saw made several of them physically sit down. It was a complete breakdown of the Terran Defense Force, total fleet strength, ship classifications, industrial output, population mobilization plans, reserve numbers. The figures were staggering, not just large, like an enemy fleet. They were large, like a supernova is large. They were numbers that simply didn't belong in the same reality as the tiny little corvette that was sending them. Fleet Master, one of his officers said, his voice trembling slightly. If these numbers are real, they're not real, Orin snapped. It's propaganda. Inflated numbers designed to scare us. It's the oldest trick in the book. But he didn't sound convinced. Santos's voice continued, calm as ever, like a teacher explaining a simple but deadly math problem. Fleet Master, the Terran Defense Force maintains a standing fleet of over 15,000 warships. And that's not even counting our reserve fleets, our system defense platforms, or our allies. When a Terran colony is threatened, we are authorized to execute something called a case iron response. That means the full mobilization of the nearest expeditionary fleet, with endless reinforcements until the threat is gone. She let that sink in. You brought 200 ships to threaten a planet of 2 million people. I need you to understand that our response will not be proportional to the size of this colony. It will be proportional to the threat you represent. A threat to any Terran world is a threat to all of them. That's not policy, Fleet Master. It's doctrine, hardwired into our command structure. No single officer can stop it. You're stalling, Orin accused. You're just one ship trying to buy time. Yes, Santos said without hesitation. I am absolutely trying to buy time. The question you should be asking yourself, she added calmly, is what I'm buying time for. Oren's jaw clenched. He was young, a rising star given this easy mission to prove his worth. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. He glanced at his display. 200 warships versus 1 corvette. The math was simple. It was always simple. All ships, advance, he commanded. Standard formation. Prepare ground forces for landing. On the bridge of the Whiskey Tango, Santos watched the red dots begin to creep forward. She gave a slow, sad nod. She'd hoped they would listen. You hope for sunshine, but you still pack an umbrella. She'd packed her umbrella. Comms, she ordered. Coded FTL burst. Priority 1. Send the following message. She took a deep breath. Whiskey Tango to Forge Actual, Artemis 4. They didn't listen. Execute case iron. The message, a tiny burst of data, shot faster than light through a secret relay network. It was wrapped in an encryption the hegemony couldn't dream of breaking, heading to a destination they never knew existed. It arrived in seconds. Santos turned to her helm officer. Take us out of their path. Weapons on standby. But do not, I repeat, do not power up targeting systems. Ma'am? The officer asked, confused. We're not fighting? No, Lieutenant, we are not engaging. We are observing. But ma'am, if they reach the colony... They will reach the colony, she said grimly. We can't stop 200 warships with 1 corvette. That was never the plan. The Whiskey Tango gracefully slid out of the enemy's way, parking at a safe distance, and Santos just sat there, watching the red dots close in on the planet Artemis 4. From the bridge of his flagship, Aaron watched the tiny corvette move. He'd expected it to run or make a suicidal attack. He never expected it to just move aside and watch. A private message pinged on his console. It was from Drench, a Torvon advisor. She's not running. She's not fighting. She's waiting, the message read. I don't know what she's waiting for, Fleetmaster, but the fact that she is so calm terrifies me more than any weapon I've ever seen. I strongly advise you to reconsider. Oren deleted the message. 3 hours later, the hegemony fleet settled into orbit. The planet below looked just as pathetic as the scouting reports had claimed. Dusty, barely developed, no threat at all. Oren gave the order. Troop transports began their descent, carrying thousands of armored soldiers and vehicles towards a world with no visible defenses. It should have felt like a glorious victory. Instead, it felt like walking into a trap. And just as the first transports hit the atmosphere, space itself seemed to tear open behind the hegemony fleet. Not 1 or 2 ships, but hundreds of tiers in reality, and from them emerged the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. They were titans of metal and light, their weapon ports already glowing. There was no request for surrender. There was no warning shot. There was only the calm, overwhelming, and utterly devastating execution of case iron. The hegemony learned a brutal lesson that day. You don't judge the hive by the size of a single bee. Hunter, grab your personal emergency kits and nothing else. Do not, I repeat, do not engage any approaching forces. The people of New Thessaly were on the move. They moved with a quiet, swift precision that spoke of endless drills. On the colony of Artemis 4, every single home had a go-bag ready. Every citizen knew exactly which shelter to run to. Every entrance was clearly marked, meticulously maintained, and fully stocked. The shelters were dug deep, incredibly deep into the planet's bedrock, with mining gear shipped all the way from Sol. It was an absurd expense for a simple farming colony on a dusty, forgotten world. The tunnels plunged hundreds of meters down, spreading out into vast networks that linked every town on the continent. They were heavily reinforced and packed with supplies. And if you had a military eye, you'd realize they weren't shelters at all. They were bunkers. The hegemony's ground troops marched into deserted towns. The streets were empty, the buildings abandoned. Doors were left hanging open, and half-eaten meals sat on tables. The colonists had just disappeared into the earth. A Voxy squad leader radioed his commander. "Sir, the settlement's a ghost town. No fight, no one here. They're just gone." "Find them," the commander snapped back. They tried. The first squad to poke their heads into a tunnel entrance was met by an automated turret that took out 3 soldiers with surgical precision before they could scramble back. The second squad tried a different entrance. They made it 50 meters in before the tunnel caved in right behind them, trapping them. It took 6 hours of frantic digging to get back to the surface. The colonists weren't putting up a fight. The planet itself was. Every single tunnel was a death trap. Every entrance was covered. The colony's entire infrastructure, the roads, the railways, the power lines that looked so harmless from orbit, was secretly rigged with systems designed to make an invader's life a living hell. Still, this was just an annoyance, not a real problem. Oren had 200 warships and a whole army. He could tear this planet apart, piece by piece, if he had to. The humans could hide in their holes for a while, but there they'd have to come up for air eventually. He settled in for a long wait. High in orbit above him, the Whiskey Tango floated in silence. Captain Santos just sat in her command chair, sipping another cup of coffee and watching the tactical display without saying a word. On the ground, just outside of New Thessaly, a grizzled old farmer named Hector Moran was the last person to reach his shelter door. He was 67 years old. He'd come to Artemis IV 20 years ago because he wanted to build something real with his own 2 hands. And he had. He'd turned 200 acres of barren dirt into a thriving farm. He was damn proud of that farm. He'd poured his soul into that soil. He paused for a moment at the shelter entrance and glanced up at the sky. It was swarming with alien warships. They shimmered in the starlight, glittering like cruel jewels against the pale blue sky. Before he was a farmer, Hector Moran had served 12 years in the Terran Defense Force. He'd seen combat in 3 separate engagements. He knew what warships looked like, he knew what they could do, and he knew what their presence meant. He also knew what a case iron signal meant. Every veteran did. He stared up at the sky, thick with hegemony ships, and just slowly shook his head. "You poor dumb bastards," he muttered. Then he slipped underground, sealing the heavy door behind him. Far out in the cold, dark space between Artemis and Sol, something was coming. Something that didn't appear on any sensor. Something that was utterly silent, cast no light, and left no trace. Something unimaginably large. There's a special kind of blackness between the stars that most people never get to see. It's not the dark of a moonless night, or a deep cave, or a room with the lights off. It's the darkness of absolute nothing. A true, infinite void. No light, no heat, not a speck of matter to speak of, just a vacuum stretching on forever in every direction. And in that darkness, something stirred. It didn't announce its arrival. It didn't glow or pulse with energy. It didn't broadcast an ID code or leave the faint gravitational ripple that most faster-than-light drives create. It moved through the void like a great white shark hunting in the deep ocean, silent, patient, and very, very aware. The TDF Thermopylae was 2 kilometers long. On its own, that number doesn't really mean much. Space is vast, and 2 kilometers is just a tiny speck against the gulf between stars. But the Thermopylae wasn't meant to be measured against the void. It was meant to be measured against other warships. And against other warships, it was a monster. It was roughly 8 times longer than the biggest Voxy capital ship currently parked over Artemis IV. It had more mass than any 40 of their ships put together. It was a Forge-class dreadnought, and the entire Terran Defense Force only had 12 of them. Not because they couldn't build more, but because 12 was all they ever needed. The Thermopylae looked nothing like a Voxy warship. Voxy ships were graceful, all sleek curves and gleaming hulls. They were designed to be looked at, to be admired. The Thermopylae was designed to do a job. It was all hard angles and flat armor plates. There were no curves, no elegant lines, no artistic touches whatsoever. Its hull was a deep, matte gray that seemed to swallow light instead of reflecting it. The entire surface was dotted with weapon emplacements, sensor arrays, and launch bays, all of them sunk deep into the armor instead of sitting on top. Anything that could be protected was protected. Anything that could be hidden was hidden. The ship looked like it had been carved from a solid block of steel by someone who despised anything that wasn't purely functional. A Voxy scout commander once said that Terran ships looked like they were built by a species that fully expected to die and didn't give a damn. She was only half right. The Thermopylae was built by a species that expected to get hit with everything the universe could possibly throw at it, and fully intended to keep on fighting. On the bridge of the Thermopylae, Admiral Jun-Seo Park sat in his command chair, reading the latest tactical update from Captain Santos. Park was 61 years old. He had silver hair, a weathered face, and hands that were rock steady. He'd been a flag officer in the Terran Defense Force for 19 years and had commanded the 7th Expeditionary Fleet for the last 7. In all that time, the 7th had never once been deployed in a full-scale war. They'd run patrols, held exercises, conducted humanitarian missions, and done enough readiness drills to last a lifetime. They had trained, they had prepared, and they had waited. For 7 years, Park had hoped he would never have to use his fleet for what it was truly built for. He was a quiet, thoughtful man. He read poetry. He played the cello, though not very well. He had a daughter who taught biology on Mars and a son who built custom furniture back on Earth. He didn't love war, but he was very, very good at it. The case iron signal from the Whiskey Tango had screamed through the relay network to Terran Command in seconds. It was verified, authenticated, and escalated in less than a minute. The 7th Expeditionary Fleet got its activation orders within 15 minutes of Santos hitting send. There was no debate, no committee meeting, no political hand-wringing. Case iron wasn't a request. It was a trigger. A preset, automatic response hardwired into the deepest levels of Terran military doctrine. When a Terran colony came under threat, the closest expeditionary fleet responded instantly, automatically. The same way your hand jerks back from a hot stove before your brain even registers the pain. The 7th Fleet made the jump to Artemis in under 6 hours. This wasn't because they were close by. The 7th was stationed at Kepler Station, nearly 40 light-years away from Artemis. They made the trip in under 6 hours because Terran FTL drives were light-years ahead of anything the hegemony thought was possible. The hegemony had based their estimates of Terran tech on watching civilian traffic in the Sol system. They saw cargo haulers, colony transports, and passenger liners, slow, bulky ships plodding between systems at speeds the hegemony thought were just okay. They had never seen a Terran military vessel because Terran military vessels are never meant to be seen. The Terran Defense Force learned a long, long time ago that the greatest advantage in any fight is the one your enemy doesn't even know you have. Their warships always run dark. No active emissions, no beacon pings, no energy signatures that can't be disguised as background radiation. When a Terran warship moves through space, it's like a submarine in an ocean of black. You don't see it. You don't hear it. You don't know it's there until the moment it wants you to know. And at that moment, 40 Terran warships were sitting in the silent darkness at the edge of the Artemis system, waiting for Admiral Park to give the word. Park read Santos's report for a third time. 200 hegemony ships, ground troops on the surface, colonists safe in their deep bunkers, 0 Terran casualties so far. The hegemony fleet was in a standard occupation pattern, spread out in orbit above Artemis IV, with all their attention focused down on the planet. They weren't watching the dark. "Fleet status," Park said, his voice calm. His flag captain, A woman named Torres, with short dark hair and a composure that came from 20 years of service, answered immediately. "All ships report battle ready, Admiral. Weapons are hot. Drives are standing by. We await your command." Park simply nodded. On the tactical display, the situation looked hopeless. 200 angry red dots swarmed around the beautiful blue-green planet of Artemis IV. On the very edge of the system sat a single, lonely green dot, Captain Santos and her ship, the Whiskey Tango. But what no one else could see were 40 more green dots, cloaked in darkness, arranged in a silent, deadly formation. "Signal the fleet," Park ordered. "We're going with Plan Meridian. I go in first. 30 seconds after I arrive, on my mark, the rest of you jump in. Standard procedure. Nobody fires a single shot until I give the word." His second-in-command, Torres, raised an eyebrow just a fraction. "Admiral, are you saying you want to go in there all by yourself first?" "I want them to see one ship," Park said calmly. "I want them to have a good, long moment to wonder what one ship could possibly mean, right before they see 40. Torres nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. She got it. This wasn't about strategy. This was about sending a message. "Signal sent, Admiral. The fleet confirms. The Thermopylae is cleared for jump." Park gave the tactical display one final glance, then set down his data pad and sat up straight in his command chair. "Take us in." The Thermopylae leaped into the void. It dropped out of faster-than-light travel right at the system's edge, about 2 million kilometers from the outermost enemy ships. It made zero attempt to be sneaky. The second it popped back into normal space, it unleashed a single, massive sensor pulse, a giant wave of scanning energy that swept across the entire system like someone flipping on a searchlight in a pitch-black room. That pulse slammed into every single hegemony ship at the exact same time. On every enemy bridge, sensor screens lit up with a brand new contact. Aboard the enemy flagship, the Throne of Certainty, the reaction was instant. "Contact!" the sensor officer yelled. "Single contact, bearing 271 mark, positive 15. Range is 2 million kilometers. It just appeared, sir. No FTL wake, no sign of approach. It wasn't there, and now it is." The fleet master, Aaron, turned away from the planetary reports he'd been reading. "Identify it." The sensor officer stared at his console, his hands flying across the controls. He reran the scan. He checked his system calibrations. He looked at the numbers, but the numbers refused to change, and a cold dread started to creep down his spine. "Fleet Master," the officer stammered, "the contact is... I'm having trouble classifying it. Its mass reading is bigger than any warship we have on record. Sir, its reading is approximately 2 kilometers long." 2 kilometers? Aaron repeated, shocked. "Yes, Fleet Master, and its power output is..." The officer trailed off, his eyes wide. "Fleet Master, its power signature is so massive, our sensors are flagging it as a stellar anomaly. They think it's a small star. I think it's an error in our algorithms. They aren't built to handle a warship of this scale." Aaron stared at the tactical display. A single, ominous dot sat at the edge of his system, the largest contact his fleet had ever encountered. "What's its armor made of?" he demanded. "Unknown, Fleet Master. The material doesn't match any known alloy in our database. It's reflecting our scans in a way I can't even begin to understand. I've never seen readings like these." The bridge fell deathly silent. Then the comms channel crackled to life. The voice that spoke was human, male, and calm, the kind of calm you find in the deepest parts of the ocean, with something huge and powerful moving just beneath the surface. "This is Admiral Junio Park of the Terran Defense Force 7th Expeditionary Fleet, aboard the dreadnought Thermopylae. I'm speaking to the commanding officer of the Veloxi Hegemony Fleet currently occupying Artemis IV." Park paused for effect. When he spoke again, his voice was just as steady. "You are on a Terran world. You were warned. You were given a chance to leave peacefully. That chance has now expired." Another beat of silence. "You have 30 seconds to begin your withdrawal, or you will be joined by the rest of my fleet." I strongly suggest you use that time wisely. The channel went dead. 30 seconds. Aaron stood on his bridge and felt the weight of those 30 seconds pressing down on his chest like a physical force. He looked at his tactical map. One ship, one enormous, impossible ship, sitting at the edge of his territory like a predator watching from the shadows. He thought about the orders from his superiors. He thought about what the Supreme Orbiter would say if he ran from a single ship, no matter how big it was. He thought about his entire career, his hard-won reputation, his future. And he made his choice. "All ships, battle formation," he commanded. "Bring all weapons online. Target that vessel." 23 seconds later, the Thermopylae fired. The main weapon of every Forge-class dreadnought was a spinal-mount kinetic accelerator. It was a massive cannon that ran the entire length of the ship, from the reactor in the back to the barrel at the very front. It fired a solid slug of tungsten alloy at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The projectile didn't have an explosive warhead. It didn't need one. At that kind of speed, the sheer kinetic energy was enough to do things most civilizations would consider physically impossible. The slug crossed 2 million kilometers of empty space in less time than it takes to blink. It slammed into the hegemony cruiser Radiant Conviction, hitting it dead center. The Radiant Conviction was a frontline warship, 300 meters long, with full shielding and heavy armor. It had served the hegemony for decades and survived battles against 4 different alien species. The tungsten slug tore through its shields as if they were made of mist. It punched through the front armor. It ripped through the bridge, the reactor core, the crew quarters, the engineering decks, and the rear armor. It exited the other side of the ship and kept going, striking the cruiser directly behind the Radiant Conviction, passing through that ship as well, and then hitting a third ship behind that one. 3 state-of-the-art warships. 1 shot. The time between the trigger pull and the final impact was less than a single second. The lead ship, the Radiant Conviction, didn't even have time to explode. There wasn't enough of it left. Along the projectile's path, the battleship just vanished. What was left were 2 halves of a warship drifting apart in the dead of space, venting air, debris, and bodies. The other 2 ships were in the same horrific state. Nobody in the hegemony fleet had ever witnessed anything like it. Their own weapons were elegant, based on energy, plasma, particle beams, focused radiation. They understood those. They could calculate their effects, predict the damage, and build defenses against them. A solid slug moving at nearly the speed of light was something they'd discussed in theory, but never, ever encountered in reality. It was always dismissed as impractical, too expensive, too hard to aim, and frankly, too primitive. But this was anything but primitive. The hegemony fleet had exactly 30 seconds to process the impossible. Some ships started taking evasive action. Others powered up their weapons and fired back, sending brilliant lances of plasma screaming across the void toward the human ship. The beams slammed into the dreadnought's armor and splashed against it like water on stone, leaving behind nothing but ugly scorch marks. They didn't even scratch the paint. Then, their 30 seconds were up. The rest of the 7th Fleet arrived. 40 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, perfectly surrounding the hegemony fleet from every possible angle. They didn't appear in a neat, orderly formation. They came in a chaotic, terrifying spread, with each ship popping into existence at a different position, a different angle, covering every escape route. There was no fancy geometry, no clean lines, no parade ground patterns. They just appeared, each one already in motion, already locking onto its targets. Destroyers, cruisers, frigates, and carrier groups. And at the very center of it all sat the Thermopylae, vast, dark, and impossibly patient. On the bridge of the Throne of Certainty, Fleet Master Aaron watched in horror as his tactical display filled with green dots. 40 of them, trapping his 200 ships in a web of steel and firepower. His sensor officer was rattling off new contacts, his voice gone flat and robotic. The way a person sounds when their brain is refusing to accept what their eyes are seeing. 40 warships, Fleetmaster. Multiple classes. Every single one of their ships reads as superior to our own heavy cruisers in tonnage, weapons, and power output. Their formation is... It's not standard. I can't predict their attack vector. Sir, they have targeting locks on our entire fleet. Aaron couldn't find the words to speak. Across the system, Captain Santos watched the scene unfold from the bridge of the Whiskey Tango. She'd been waiting for this moment for hours, but seeing it happen brought her no joy. She opened a channel to the Hegemony flagship. "Fleetmaster Aaron," she said, "this is Captain Santos. Like I told you earlier, I wasn't here to fight you. I was just here to make sure you understood what was going to happen next. What you're seeing right now," she continued softly, "is what happens next." She let that sink in. "I would like to repeat my original offer. Please, withdraw your forces from Terran space. We have no wish to destroy your fleet. The Admiral gave you every possible chance to leave. I'm personally asking you to take this one." Aaron heard her words, but he was staring at his tactical display. 200 of his ships, surrounded by 40 of theirs, and in that moment, he realized with a clarity that felt like ice water flooding his veins that his 200 ships were completely outgunned. Not outnumbered, outgunned. Every single one of those 40 Terran warships was worth 10 of his, maybe even more. The simple, cold math of warfare, the very logic that his superiors always said made battle predictable, was telling him something that every fiber of his being was already screaming. They were doomed. He was completely and utterly trapped. Miles from friendly territory, Drenak could only sit in his quarters and stare at the tactical feeds coming from the Artemis. He watched as the Terran fleet simply appeared out of nowhere, surrounding Aaron's forces. He saw the enemy count on his screen, the power signatures, the weapon readouts, and the movements of ships that fought like nothing the Hegemony had seen in its long history of conquest. He remembered what his friend Irel had said. Their ships just looked wrong, she'd told him, like they were designed by something that fully expected to die and didn't even care. Now he finally understood. These ships weren't built by a species expecting to die. They were built by a species that had faced death so many times, for so many centuries, across countless wars against themselves, that they knew down to the millimeter how much punishment a ship needed to take, and exactly how much it needed to dish out. There was zero waste, no beauty, no elegant designs, nothing that didn't serve the single purpose of keeping the crew alive and making the enemy dead. These were the ships of a people who had perfected the art of war by practicing on the only opponents they ever found worthy of the challenge: each other. Drenak closed his eyes and sent a final, desperate message to Fleet Master Orin. It was just one word: surrender. Orin stared at the message. He stared at his tactical display. He stared out the bridge viewport at the dark, ugly shape of the Thermopylae, a ship so massive it blotted out the stars like a wound torn in the fabric of space. All around him, his bridge crew waited in total silence. The entire fleet was waiting. 200 warships, the absolute pride of the Veloxi hegemony, were now surrounded by a mere 40 ships from a species they had openly laughed at just weeks before. No one was laughing now. Fleetmaster Orin decided to fight. He didn't choose to fight because he thought he could win. The tactical display had already told him everything he needed to know about his chances, and the numbers were cruel. He chose to fight because of what was waiting for him if he didn't. If he surrendered 200 warships without even firing a shot, the Supreme Arbiter, Kayix Vone, would utterly destroy him. Not in a figurative sense. The Supreme Arbiter had no tolerance for failure, and he considered cowardice the ultimate sin. Orin would be stripped of his rank, his family would be shamed for generations, and he would live out the rest of his short life in a dark cell beneath the war chamber. He would be made an example to anyone else who might even consider the unthinkable act of retreating from a lesser species. At least if he fought, there would be a story to tell. A fleet that went down swinging against a terrifying new enemy was a fleet that could be honored. A defeat in battle was acceptable. Surrender was not. It was a foolish reason to send thousands of good soldiers to their deaths, and Orin knew it. But he gave the order anyway. "All ships, engage," he said. His voice was perfectly steady. He owed his crews that much, at least. "Fleet formation Primus. Concentrate all fire on that large vessel. Launch all fighter wings. All point defense systems, active." 200 warships turned as one and opened fire. The void between the two fleets erupted in a storm of plasma. Brilliant blue bolts of superheated matter converged on the Thermopylae from dozens of directions at once. Particle beams shot out like needles of pure white light. Missile batteries emptied their payloads into space, sending swarms of guided munitions screaming toward the nearest Terran ships. It was a breathtaking display of power. The combined firepower of 200 Veloxi warships was enough to crack the crust of a small moon. It was the kind of overwhelming force that had ended wars in a matter of hours, that had shattered entire species, and that had made the hegemony's name synonymous with unstoppable military might across two arms of the galaxy. The Thermopylae took it all. Plasma bolts slammed into the dreadnought's armor and simply vanished. Particle beams carved glowing lines of molten metal across the hull that cooled and hardened in a split second. Missiles detonated against the surface in silent flashes of light that briefly lit up the ship's colossal silhouette before fading into nothing. The armor held. On the bridge of the Thermopylae, Admiral Park barely felt the deck vibrate under his feet as his ship absorbed the combined rage of an entire enemy fleet. A few warning lights flickered on the damage control panels. Somewhere deep inside the ship, a secondary hull plate buckled from the sustained fire and was immediately reinforced by automated repair drones. "Damage report," Admiral Park said calmly. "Outer armor degradation at 7% in sectors 12 through 15, Torres reported. "No penetration, no system damage, and no casualties." 7%. 200 warships firing everything they had, and all they had managed to do was scratch the paint. "Return fire," Park said. "All batteries. Fleet-wide engagement is authorized." The Thermopylae responded. Its spinal mount fired again. Another massive tungsten slug tore across the void at a speed that turned physics itself into a weapon. It hit a hegemony battlecruiser, passed straight through it, and vaporized the destroyer that was flying behind it. 2 more ships, gone in less than a second. But the spinal mount was just one weapon. The Thermopylae had hundreds of others. Its broadside railgun batteries opened up, each one firing projectiles that were smaller than the spinal mount's rounds, but were still absolutely devastating. Point defense turrets that were designed to shoot down incoming missiles were retasked to shred enemy fighters into confetti. Missile tubes launched waves of autonomous munitions that picked their own targets, adjusted their own flight paths, and struck with a precision that was almost surgical. And then, the rest of the 7th Fleet opened fire. The 40 Terran warships had been waiting patiently in their positions, weapons locked, drives hot. When Park gave the order, they attacked from every direction at once. There was no single line of battle, no neat formation exchanging fire across a clean front line. The Terran ships descended on the hegemony fleet from above, below, ahead, behind, and from both sides, all at the same time. Terran military doctrine didn't believe in fair fights. The doctrine had a name: overwhelming response, and it had been perfected over centuries of human warfare. Its core idea was simple. When you fight to end the fight as quickly as possible, with as much force as possible, while taking as few losses as possible. There was no honor system, no ritualized combat, no tradition of meeting your enemy face to face to test your courage. There was only the objective: neutralize the threat by the most efficient path available. The hegemony fought in formations because formations were elegant, disciplined, and had worked for 1,000 years against other species that fought the exact same way. Their ships held their positions in relation to each other, maintaining overlapping fields of fire, protecting each other's flanks, and moving as a single, coordinated block. The Terrans didn't fight like that at all. Each Terran ship operated with a level of independence that would have been seen as direct insubordination in the hegemony navy. Captains made their own split-second tactical calls within the admiral's larger plan. Ships would break formation, reform, and break apart again. They used the hegemony's own damaged ships as cover, ducking behind floating wreckage to dodge return fire, only to pop out from an unexpected angle to deliver a crippling broadside. They were just faster. That was the one thing Orin just couldn't comprehend. His ships weren't slow. Veloxi warships were considered some of the most agile in the known galaxy. But the Terran ships were on another level. Not just a little bit faster, but so much faster that it completely changed the nature of the battle. The hegemony fleet was designed for one specific kind of war: close-range brawls, where their plasma weapons were most powerful. Their entire strategy relied on closing the distance with the enemy, bringing their superior numbers to bear, and crushing them with concentrated fire. But the Terran ships simply wouldn't let them get close. Every time a hegemony formation tried to advance, the Terran ships just moved. They accelerated away with ease, keeping the perfect distance where their kinetic weapons were devastatingly effective, and the hegemony's energy weapons grew weak over the same range. They hammered the advancing hegemony ships from so far away they could barely even return fire. And if a hegemony group somehow got too close, the Terran ships were already gone, having repositioned to hit them from a completely different angle. It was like trying to fight smoke. The electronic warfare only made it worse. The Terran ships were broadcasting powerful jamming signals that blinded the hegemony's sensors in chaotic, unpredictable ways. 1 second, a hegemony gunner would have a perfect target lock. The next, his screen was a useless mess of ghost contacts, fake signatures, and static. He'd fire at a target that wasn't even there, and while he was shooting at ghosts, a real Terran ship would slam him from a direction he hadn't been watching. The autonomous missile swarms were relentless. Terran missiles were nothing like hegemony missiles. They were smaller, much harder to detect, and they could think for themselves. They didn't just fly in a straight line. They worked together, splitting into groups, coming in from multiple vectors, and timing their impacts to completely overwhelm point defense systems. A hegemony cruiser could shoot down 10 missiles, but it couldn't shoot down 10 missiles all coming from 10 different directions at the exact same time. One by one, the ships fell. On the bridge of his flagship, the Throne of Certainty, Orin watched his fleet die on the tactical display. Red dots flickered and then went dark. Every single one was a ship. Every ship had a crew, and every crew had families waiting for them back home. A hegemony heavy cruiser, the Eternal Mandate, tried to make a desperate run at the Thermopylae. It charged straight ahead, all weapons blazing, its captain screaming orders to focus everything on a single point of the dreadnought's hull. The Thermopylae didn't even bother to dodge. It just soaked up the fire and answered with a single broadside that tore the Eternal Mandate apart from front to back. The glowing, spinning pieces of the cruiser drifted away into the darkness, and the Thermopylae moved on to its next target. Orin's fighter squadrons met an even worse fate. From its carriers, the hegemony unleashed a swarm of thousands of tiny attack ships. Piloted by the hegemony navy's finest, they were lightning fast and overwhelming in number, surging toward the Terran fleet in perfectly synchronized waves. and the Terran point defense systems shredded them. Every Terran vessel was bristling with small, rapid-fire turrets, all guided by targeting computers that moved faster than any living pilot could ever hope to think. The fighters flew straight into a solid wall of projectiles that turned the space before them into a meat grinder of shrapnel. Entire squadrons were simply erased in moments. The few pilots who punched through that defensive screen discovered their weapons were useless. They were designed to hurt ships built by the hegemony, but they couldn't even scratch the Terran hulls. They unleashed their entire payloads only to watch them detonate harmlessly against armor that seemed to drink the explosions. Then, the point defense guns would lock on, and they would cease to exist. Through all this carnage, Admiral Park sat in his command chair, issuing orders in the same cool, detached tone he'd used since the fight started. Task Group 3. Adjust your heading to Vector 77. You've got a carrier group attempting to flank you at 220. Destroyer Jakarta, your firing solution is obstructed by debris. Elevate 2 degrees. Cruiser Vladivostok, the battleship at your 11 o'clock, is venting its atmosphere. It's no longer a threat. Engage your next target. There was no rage in his voice, no thrill of the hunt, no rallying cry. This was simply a job. He was performing it like a surgeon performs an operation, with absolute precision, intense focus, and zero wasted effort. Every single order advanced the objective. Every maneuver served a clear purpose. He was dismantling the hegemony fleet the way a mechanic takes apart an engine, one piece at a time, in the correct sequence. Drenok, who watched from deep in hegemony space, would later struggle to explain it to the war chamber, searching for a long time before the right words finally came to him. It was like watching a doctor operate on a screaming patient, he finally said. They didn't hate us. They took no pleasure in it. They just saw a problem, and they removed it. That's what made it so horrifying. The complete and utter lack of emotion. 2 hours after the first shot was fired, the hegemony fleet had lost 80 ships, either destroyed outright or disabled, and left drifting in the void, bleeding atmosphere, fuel, and crew into space. The Terran fleet had lost 0, not a single one. A few had sustained damage, their armor scarred and systems pushed to the brink, their crews stretched thin. But every Terran ship was still in the fight. And then came the Jakarta. The TDF destroyer Jakarta was on the smaller side for the 7th Fleet. It was a fast attack vessel, with lighter armor than the cruisers or the Thermopylae. Its commander was a 34-year-old woman named Adzi Okonwo, born on a station orbiting Jupiter, who had never once stepped foot on Earth. A squadron of 5 hegemony cruisers managed to outflank the Jakarta's escort ships and trap it in a deadly crossfire. Bolts of plasma slammed into the destroyer from 3 sides at once. The engine room took a direct hit. The primary drive failed. The secondary drives died a moment later. The Jakarta was dead in the water, adrift and unable to move. The hegemony cruisers smelled blood and began to close in. This was their specialty: close quarters, concentrated firepower on a wounded target that couldn't escape. Captain Okonwo took stock of the situation. Her engines were gone. Her reactor was down to 60% power. Life support was failing across 3 decks. She had 17 wounded and 4 dead. She didn't even consider surrender. Instead, she gave the order to vent all non-essential decks to the vacuum of space. Her crew, sealed inside their suits on internal oxygen, abandoned every part of the ship not directly needed for combat. All the power that had been routed to life support, artificial gravity, lighting, and heating was diverted straight to the weapons and shields. The Jakarta couldn't run, but it could still bite. The 5 hegemony cruisers learned this the hard way when they moved into what they thought was killing range, only for the Jakarta to unleash hell with everything it had left. Its railgun batteries fired in continuous, screaming streams. The point defense turrets, no longer needing to track fighters, were aimed at the cruiser's weaker armor. Missile tubes emptied their remaining ordnance at point-blank range. The first hegemony cruiser simply vanished. The second lost all its weapon systems and started to tumble. The third tried to pull back, but caught a railgun volley straight to its reactor core. The fourth blundered into the Jakarta's debris field, which shredded its navigation systems. The fifth cruiser scored a few more hits on the crippled destroyer before a full broadside from the Jakarta's port batteries ripped its hull wide open. By the time a Terran cruiser group finally broke through to relieve the Jakarta, Captain Okonwo's crippled, venting, half-dead ship had personally destroyed 5 hegemony cruisers and crippled 6 more that had tried to help. When the rescue party came aboard, they found the crew still at their posts, still sealed in their vacuum suits, and still firing. The ship was almost out of ammunition. 3 more crew members were dead. The survivors were bruised, bleeding, utterly exhausted, and seething with rage. But they weren't furious at the hegemony. They were furious with themselves. "We should have gotten more," Captain Okonwo told the rescue commander. Her face was caked in blood, and one eye was swollen completely shut. She hadn't moved from her command chair in 4 hours. "They sent 5, and we only bagged 5. We had enough ammo for at least 3 more. The rescue commander just stared at her. He'd been in the Terran Defense Force for 15 years and had seen some incredible things, but the look in Okonwo's one good eye was something he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. 3 hours after it started, the battle was over. Out of the hegemony's 200 warships, 140 were now floating wreckage. These broken husks drifted in the space around Artemis IV, wreathed in clouds of debris, frozen atmosphere, and the bodies of their crews. The Terran fleet had methodically herded the remaining 60 ships into a tight, helpless cluster. They were surrounded, their weapons still hot, but their situation was beyond hopeless. Admiral Park opened a channel. "Fleet Master Oren, you have fought. Your fleet has fought bravely. The courage of your officers and crew is beyond doubt, but this engagement is concluded. You have lost." His voice was the same as it had been all along, calm, steady, and strangely respectful. "Surrender your remaining ships, and your crews will be treated humanely. They will get medical aid. They will be given food, water, and shelter. When the political situation allows, they will be repatriated to the hegemony. You have my word, and the word of the Terran Defense Force." There was a brief silence. "This offer stands once." On the bridge of the Throne of Certainty, Fleetmaster Oren surveyed the ruins of his command. 60 damaged ships, running low on ammunition, completely encircled. His crew looked at him, not with anger or blame, but with a profound exhaustion, with the hollowed-out eyes of people who had just spent 3 hours watching 140 ships, full of their friends, be systematically annihilated. He thought of Kykes' vow. He thought of disgrace, a prison, and the cold cell waiting for him beneath the war chamber. Then he thought of the crews on his last 60 ships, of the thousands of lives hanging on his very next word. He shut his eyes. "Ships," he said, his voice heavy. "Stand down. Power down all weapon systems. This is Fleetmaster Oren. I am ordering a general surrender." The hegemony fleet fell silent. One by one, their weapons went cold. Their shields collapsed. Their engines quieted to an idle hum. It was finished. Down on the surface of Artemis IV, the hegemony ground troops had watched the entire battle unfold in the sky. They had seen their fleet burn. They had seen the bright flashes of dying ships streaking through the thin atmosphere like terrible falling stars. They had heard the comms chatter, the frantic calls for help, the orders cut short mid-sentence, and the long, terrible silence that always followed. They were stranded, Their fleet was gone. Their commanders were either dead or had just surrendered. They were standing on a planet full of fortified bunkers they couldn't possibly breach, surrounded by automated defenses they couldn't defeat, under a sky that now belonged to an enemy they couldn't fight. They dropped their weapons. The bunker doors opened. The colonists of Artemis IV emerged, blinking in the daylight, carrying their children and helping the elderly, all looking up at a sky still hazy with the distant glow of smoldering wreckage. Terran Marines arrived within the hour. Dropships landed outside every settlement, unloading squads of armored soldiers who moved through the streets with a quiet, practiced efficiency. They secured the hegemony prisoners, set up perimeters, and established field hospitals. There were no reprisals, no acts of revenge, no cruelty. The Voxy soldiers were disarmed, handed water, and guided through intake stations where their injuries were treated and their names were recorded. A Terran medic knelt by a wounded Voxy soldier with a nasty burn on his leg and spent 20 minutes carefully treating the injury with supplies from her own pack before moving on to help a human with a broken arm. The Voxy soldier watched her walk away with a look on his face that no one from the hegemony would have recognized. He'd been taught that Terrans were primitives, aggressive, and barely civilized. He'd been told they were nothing more than animals. And he had just watched one of these animals bandage his leg, give him painkillers, and tell him through a translation device that he was going to be all right. In the processing line, a captured Veloxy officer found himself standing next to a Terran Marine, handling the prisoners. The Veloxy was a commander of respectable rank. He'd fought bravely. He'd been defeated. He studied the Marine, who was young and bone-tired. The kid's armor was caked in dust and covered in scratches, making him look like he'd been doing back-breaking work for way too long and just wanted to go home. "Why?" the Veloxy officer asked. The Marine glanced up. "Why didn't your admiral just wipe us all out? He could have. The 60 ships that surrendered. He could have vaporized every single one. We were dead in the water. Why did he stop?" The Marine just looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small shrug. "Yeah," he said. "He could have. That's the point." The Veloxy officer didn't get it. He'd replay those words in his mind for a long, long time before he finally would. High above the planet Artemis IV, the silent wreckage of 140 warships drifted through space. The 60 surviving ships sat powerless, boxed in by Terran escorts. The warship Thermopylae hung in high orbit, a dark, massive, and silent sentinel, watching over it all like a monument to a lesson learned the hardest way imaginable. On the bridge of the Whiskey Tango, Captain Santos sat in her command chair, sipping coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She stared at the tactical display. Green dots everywhere, the blue world spinning below. The red dots were all gone. She was so incredibly tired. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, slow breath. "Okay," she said, to absolutely no one. "Now comes the hard part." The Grand War Chamber of the Hegemony looked exactly as it always had. The same crystalline walls, the same perfectly polished floor, the same ceiling that faded into an endless shadow above, the same platform of black crystal where the Supreme Arbiter presided over everyone. But it didn't feel the same. The last time this chamber was full, the very air had vibrated with confidence. Commanders had shared jokes. Aides had whispered back and forth. In the galleries, representatives from 60 conquered species had watched the business of empire unfold with the effortless certainty of a civilization that had never once faced a real challenge. Now the chamber was dead silent. The same commanders sat in the same seats. The same aides stood at their posts. The same galleries were filled with the same representatives. But the laughter was gone. The whispers had vanished. The confidence had evaporated, and all that was left was that unique, heavy feeling that fills a room when every single person knows something truly awful has happened, and not one of them has a clue what to do next. The news from Artemis IV had arrived 2 days ago. It had torn through the hegemony like a wildfire in a dead forest, fast, unstoppable, and utterly devastating. 200 warships, gone. 140 destroyed, 60 captured. The entire subjugation fleet, from its commander to its support ships and ground troops, had been wiped out or taken prisoner by a force less than a quarter of its size. In 3 hours. The numbers just didn't make sense. Every strategist in the hegemony had run them, double-checked them, and run them again. The result was always the same. A fleet of 40 Terran warships had annihilated a fleet of 200 hegemony warships in 3 hours flat, and in the process had not lost a single ship. Not one. The numbers didn't just tell a story of defeat. They told a story of a gap, a chasm between what the hegemony was and what the Terrans were. A gap so enormous, so fundamental, that it challenged everything the hegemony believed about itself and its dominance in the galaxy. Supreme Arbiter KX Vaughn didn't see it that way. He stood on his platform, all 4 of his arms gripping the railing, his scales flashing between colors so quickly they seemed to blur. His golden eyes scanned the chamber, burning with the rage of a man who felt personally insulted by the universe itself. "Yes, this was a failure of command," he boomed, his voice filling every corner of the vast room. It was loud, it was furious, and it was completely certain. Fleetmaster Orin was given a simple task. He failed. His failure is not a sign of Terran strength. It is a sign of his weakness. He began to pace on the platform, his steps echoing on the black crystal. "The Terrans caught us by surprise. They used tricks and primitive weapons we weren't expecting. This will not happen again. I am ordering a full mobilization. 2,000 warships. Every available fleet. We will return to Terran space with a force so overwhelming that no amount of trickery or crude kinetic weapons can possibly save them." He spun to face the chamber head-on. The hegemony does not lose. The hegemony has never lost. What happened at Artemis was not a defeat. No, it was a lesson on the consequences of sending a child to do a warrior's job. I will not make that mistake again. The chamber was silent. But it wasn't the silence of agreement. It was the silence of people desperate to object but terrified to speak. Then a voice cut through the quiet from the back of the central ring. A rough, gravelly voice that sounded like stones grinding together. "You are wrong." Every head in the chamber whipped around. Drenoch was on his feet. He hadn't been asked to speak. He hadn't requested permission. He simply rose from his seat in the corner of the ring, the very same seat he'd sat in during Irel's report all those weeks ago, and spoke his mind. He was old. He was covered in scars. He was Torvan, not Veloxi. His seat at the war table was a courtesy, not a right. He had zero authority to address the Supreme Arbiter without being recognized. And he had no political allies to protect him. He had nothing, except for the fact that he was the oldest living combat veteran in the room, and he had long since stopped caring about his career. "You are wrong," he repeated, his voice louder this time. "And if you send 2,000 ships into Terran space, you will lose 2,000 ships." The silence in the chamber suddenly became the kind that comes right before an explosion of violence. KX Vaughn glared down at Drenoch with a look that had made admirals tremble and planetary governors grovel. It had absolutely no effect on the old Torvan. "You forget your place, advisor. My place is to advise, so I am advising. Whether you listen is up to you. But I will not stand by in this chamber and watch this civilization commit suicide because its leader is too proud to look at the facts." Drenoch started walking forward. He moved slowly, his old joints aching from sitting too long. but he moved with the unshakable purpose of someone who had made up his mind and wouldn't be stopped by anything short of main force. He reached the speaker's platform, the same one where Irel had stood. He activated the display and started pulling up files. "This is Scout Commander Irel's original report," he announced. "The one this chamber laughed at. I want every one of you to look at it again." The data flooded the display. Population, industrial capacity, rates of technological progress, fleet estimates, all the information Irel had presented, and all the information that had been dismissed as impossible fantasy. "These numbers were accurate," Drenok stated, his voice flat. "Every last one of them. Irel's intelligence was sound. Her analysis was sound. Her recommendation was sound. This chamber chose to ignore her because her conclusions made you uncomfortable, and because it's much easier to laugh at a young officer than to face the possibility that the universe holds something stronger than us." He pulled up new files, the battle recordings from Artemis 4. "This is what happened when we ignored her. 200 ships, 3 hours, 0 Terran losses. Watch their engagement patterns, watch their maneuvers, watch how they coordinate. This isn't an army that got lucky. This isn't a fleet that just caught us off guard. This is a military machine that has been gearing up for a fight like this for longer than most of our species have even been traveling in space." He let the recording play. The chamber watched in stunned silence as the hegemony fleet was systematically taken apart. They saw the surgical precision of the Terran attacks, the flawless efficiency of their coordination, the cold, methodical way they erased one ship after another while taking no damage themselves. "Now," Drenok said, and his voice was suddenly quiet, which made it far more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Let me tell you what 2,000 ships will accomplish." He brought up projections. Industrial output of Terran shipyards, production timelines, replacement rates, force escalation models. The Terrans sent 40 ships to Artemis. 40. That was a single expeditionary fleet. They have at least 20 more just like it. They have 12 dreadnoughts of the class that single-handedly absorbed the firepower of our entire force without taking any meaningful damage. Their shipyards can build warships faster than we can find crews for them. Their population can sustain casualty levels that would shatter any species in the hegemony. He paused for effect. And they have not yet mobilized. What hit us at Artemis wasn't a war response. It was a garrison response, the military equivalent of a reflex. They sent the closest available unit to deal with a local problem, and that closest available unit utterly destroyed us. He looked directly up at KX Vaughn. If you send 2,000 ships, they will send 2,000 ships back, or 5,000, or 10,000. They can do it. Their industrial base can handle it. Their population can handle it. And every single ship they send will be crewed by soldiers from a species that has been fighting wars since before our ancestors even learned to speak. He took a deep breath. You are not preparing for a war with a rival power, Supreme Arbiter. You are preparing to knock on the door of a sleeping giant and ask it to eat you. The chamber was perfectly still. The shifting colors of KX Vaughn's scales had frozen into a deep, dark blue, a shade that spoke of an anger so intense it had burned past hot rage and settled into an icy calm. You are finished, he declared. I'm finished when I've said what I came here to say. No, you are finished now. But Drenok didn't budge. He stood his ground on the speaker's platform, looking up at the Supreme Arbiter of the Veloxy hegemony, and just waited. The moment stretched into an eternity. Suddenly, the communication station at the chamber's edge lit up. An incoming Priority 1 transmission, the officer announced, from outside hegemony space, from Terra. The communications officer glanced at KX Vaughn. The Supreme Arbiter gave a single, sharp nod. The message was patched through. The voice that filled the room was human, female, and carried a calmness entirely different from Admiral Park's. Park's calm had been the tranquility of immense power held in check. This was the calm of someone who was an expert with words and saw them as the best tool for any job. This is Ambassador Chen Wei of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. I'm broadcasting this message on behalf of the government of the Terran Federation. It is addressed to the Supreme Arbiter of the Veloxi Hegemony and all assembled members of the Hegemony Council. The entire chamber was still as stone, every single being focused on the speakers. First, I want to clearly state the Terran Federation's genuine desire for peace. We have no interest in war with the Hegemony. We are not after your territory. We have no desire for conquest. We are fully aware of the Hegemony's long history, your great achievements, and your influential position in this part of the galaxy. We respect the civilization you have built, her voice continued, unwavering and warm. However, the Artemis IV system is sovereign Terran space. Its inhabitants are Terran citizens. When your fleet entered that system and threatened our people, you prompted a defensive action on our part. That action is now over. Your surviving ships and personnel are being treated humanely, and we are ready to discuss their repatriation whenever you are ready. She paused, letting the words sink in. We would much rather be your neighbors. We would prefer to engage in trade, to share knowledge, to create something new together. The galaxy is certainly big enough for both our civilizations, and we truly believe that cooperation between us could lead to benefits neither of us could ever hope to achieve alone. Another pause followed, this one lasting even longer. But if you decide on war, there is something you must understand about us. This isn't a threat. It isn't a boast. It is simply a piece of information we feel you must have before you make your final choice. The ambassador's tone didn't shift at all. It didn't get colder or louder or harder. It remained exactly the same, which somehow made her next words infinitely more terrifying. If you choose war, we will not fight by your rules. We will not cease hostilities when honor is satisfied. We won't come to the negotiating table just because the odds have shifted. We will not accept a partial victory or a compromise that lets you save face. We will continue the fight until the threat to our people is gone, completely and permanently. This isn't a matter of policy. It's not something our leaders simply decided on. It is a fundamental truth of our culture, forged over 10,000 years of constant warfare amongst ourselves. It is simply who we are. She allowed that thought to hang in the air for a moment. We do not want to show you that side of us. We would much, much prefer to show you who we can be when we are not at war. We are builders. We are explorers. We are a curious and creative people, deeply fascinated by the universe and everything in it, including you. We would rather study your civilization than engage in combat with it. We would rather learn from you than be forced to destroy you. But make no mistake, we will do whatever it takes to protect our own, every single time, without hesitation and without any limit. The ambassador's voice softened just a little. We are now transmitting the coordinates for a proposed diplomatic conference on neutral ground, a moon in the Kepler 442 system, which belongs to neither of us. We suggest a meeting within the next 30 standard days. No weapons, no warships. Just our representatives sitting in a room, discussing what the future could hold. A final silence. We truly hope you will be there. Ambassador Chen Wei, Terran Diplomatic Corps, signing off. The transmission cut out. The grand war chamber of the Hegemony was utterly silent. 200 beings occupied a room designed to radiate power, yet not a single one of them dared to make a sound. Kayex's Vone remained on his platform. His arms were locked stiffly at his sides. His golden eyes were fixed on the communication station, as if willing the message to start again and say something different. He scanned the chamber, his gaze falling on his fleet commanders, his top strategists, his weapons designers, and his political advisors. He looked at the faces of all the different species in the gallery, the conquered peoples who had seen the hegemony's power go unchallenged for centuries. He was searching for a sign of support, for anyone who would rise and declare, "Yes, we fight." He desperately needed someone to give him the excuse to do what every fiber of his pride was screaming for. He found no one. His commanders avoided his gaze. His strategists stared intently at their data pads. His weapons engineers were silent. Even his most ardent followers, the officers who had been with him for decades, who had celebrated when IRL was dismissed, who had scoffed at the very idea of a species from a death world daring to challenge the hegemony, said nothing. They had all seen the reports. Drenak's reports, the battle footage from Artemis IV, the industrial projections, the population data, and the one number that overshadowed them all: 0. 0 Terran ships had been lost. They finally believed the numbers. The scales on Kayak's phone shifted from blue to silver and back again. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched and unclenched. And then, from the back of the chamber, Scout Commander Irel rose to her feet. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She just stood there in the observer's gallery, where she'd been summoned as a witness, and looked directly at the Supreme Arbiter. Her face was composed. Her hands were perfectly still. This was not the timid young officer who had trembled on the speaker's platform while the whole chamber had laughed at her warnings. She stood, and she waited, and her very presence screamed everything that needed to be said. I warned you all, and you laughed. People are dead because you laughed. Kayak's Zvone stared back at her. A flicker of something crossed his face. It wasn't an apology. He was incapable of such a thing. But it was recognition. The kind of recognition you feel when you finally realize the person you dismissed was the only one in the room who saw the truth. He closed his eyes. Xing, send a reply to the Terran Diplomatic Corps, he said. His voice was low, drained of all its earlier fury and certainty. It was just a voice. Tell them the hegemony will be at the summit. A collective sigh rippled through the chamber. It wasn't a sound of relief, but something far more complex. The sound of a civilization that had just stared into the abyss, and at the very last second, chosen to take a step back. 3 months later, the neutral moon in the Kepler 442 system was a small, airless, and completely forgettable rock. It had been chosen for that very reason. It belonged to no one, was important to no one, and had 0 strategic value. It was a blank slate. The summit that followed was both better than anyone had dared to dream, and worse than anyone had feared. There were heated arguments, accusations, and dramatic walkouts. There were moments when it felt like the whole fragile process was about to shatter. But there were also agreements. They started small, with prisoner exchanges, the drawing of official borders, and protocols for communication. Then they grew larger, covering trade frameworks, scientific partnerships, and a mutual non-aggression pact that everyone knew was only as good as the trust behind it. It wasn't peace, not really. But it was the absence of war, and for the time being, that was more than enough. High above a neutral planet, the very first joint Terran hegemony research facility officially opened. It was a humble beginning, really just a converted trading post refitted with labs, conference rooms, and a cafeteria that served food from 12 different species and managed to make all of it taste equally bad. Dan made a trip to the station about 6 months after the summit. He strolled slowly through its corridors, just watching. He saw Voxy scientists working side by side with human scientists, measuring the same cosmic events, debating the same sets of data, and making the exact same frustrated expressions when an experiment failed to work as planned. It was definitely awkward. The old resentments were still there, easy to see in the tense body language, the overly formal politeness, and the way both species tended to stick with their own kind during breaks. And yet, they were there, together, in the same room, tackling the same challenges. That was something. He eventually found a quiet corner in the cafeteria where a human engineer was sitting with a Voxy technician. The human had just slid a mug of a dark, steaming liquid across the table to the Voxy. "Go on, try it," the human urged. She had that specific grin humans get when they're eagerly anticipating someone else's mild suffering. It's called coffee. It's basically the fuel our entire civilization runs on. The Voxy technician carefully lifted the mug with both hands and gave it a suspicious sniff. His scales rippled in a pattern that clearly meant he was distrustful. He took a tiny sip. His reaction was instantaneous and quite dramatic. His scales clamped down flat against his body. His eyes went wide. His mouth flapped open and closed a few times without making a sound. He placed the mug back on the table with the extreme care of someone handling a live bomb. "That," he said, forcing the words out, "is the single worst thing I have ever tasted. It's bitter, it's hot, it burns, and I'm fairly certain it might be poison." The human woman laughed. It wasn't the cold, cruel laugh from the war room. This was different. The kind of laugh you share over something completely ridiculous with someone you're just starting to understand. "Yeah," she said with a grin, "it's terrible. Have another sip. It grows on you." He looked at his cup in disbelief. "Nothing that tastes like this should be allowed to grow on anyone." She just shrugged. "We drink 4 cups a day." "That," he declared, "explains so much about your species." Danak watched them from across the room. He didn't smile. Torvins couldn't. But something in his old, scarred face seemed to soften. Irel had been promoted, quietly, with no ceremony or public acknowledgement that her initial intelligence report had been 100% correct. She was now the Director of Xenological Intelligence, a new position created just for her. Her mission was to review and analyze every single scout report in the Hijgamani's entire database. Her very first act was to pull every dismissed report from the past 100 years and flag them all for immediate reevaluation. There were a lot of them. She never asked for credit. She didn't want an apology from Kayak's council. She didn't even seem angry. When Drano asked her about it, she just said that being right was never the point. The point was making sure the next warning would be heard. Captain Santos received a commendation and a new assignment. She was now the Terran ambassador-at-arms to the Hijgamani border region, a job that was half diplomat, half military liaison, and completely perfect for someone who could tell an enemy fleet to back off and actually mean it. She still drank way too much coffee. She still wore a wrinkled uniform. And according to every report, she was incredibly good at her job. Fleet Master Aaron was sent back to the Hijgamani as part of a prisoner exchange. He wasn't punished, though the possibility hung over his head for months. In the end, the political reality was simple. Punishing the commander from that battle would mean publicly admitting just how badly they had been beaten. Kayak's council preferred to just let the whole thing fade from public memory. Oruran was quietly reassigned to a logistics desk job. He never protested. Instead, he spent his evenings writing a detailed analysis of Terran military strategy that nobody in the High Command had asked for, but which would, years later, become required reading at the Hijgamani's Naval Academy. Captain Okonkwo of the Jakarta was awarded the Terran Star of Valor. Her ship was repaired and put back into active service. She immediately requested, and was granted, reassignment right back to the 7th Fleet. When a reporter asked why she hadn't accepted the promotion she was offered, she simply said that she liked her ship, she liked her crew, and she wasn't done yet. Admiral Park returned to Kepler Station with the 7th Fleet. He wrote a brief after-action report that was exactly 4 pages long. It covered the engagement, the tactics, the outcome, and his recommendations. It was precise, clinical, and showed no emotion whatsoever. But he also wrote a private letter to Terran Command. It wasn't part of the official record. It was personal. He wrote it late one night, alone in his quarters with a glass of something strong, his cello leaning against the wall in the corner. The letter talked about many things. It dissected the battle. It analyzed the enemy. It discussed the performance of his fleet and his officers, and the awful cold math of destroying 140 ships full of living beings who had done nothing wrong except follow the orders of leaders who had made a disastrous mistake. But the very last paragraph was the one that truly mattered. They learned, Park wrote. That is the best possible outcome. They saw what we are capable of, and they chose to talk instead of fight. And that means something. It means the galaxy might be a little bigger tomorrow than it was yesterday, a little more open, a little more connected. He paused, looking at the words on the screen. The galaxy is too big and too beautiful for the alternative. I've seen it from the bridge of a warship, and I know what it looks like when it's lit up by weapons fire. I don't want to see that again. I want to see it lit by the light of stars and the glow of stations where people from different worlds can sit together, drink terrible coffee, and argue about things that don't matter. He set down his glass. But keep the 7th Fleet ready, he added, just in case the next ones don't learn as quickly. He signed the letter, sent it, and went to bed. Outside his window, the stars burned, billions of them, old and young, bright and dim, each one a sun, each sun possibly warming a world, each world possibly holding someone looking up at the sky and wondering what else was out there. The galaxy was very, very large, and it was full of questions. And for the first time in a long time, at least 2 civilizations were starting to ask them together. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't a sad ending. It was a beginning, and that was more than enough.